Welcome to our Timely Topics webinar on the important issue of providing a quality education to all of North Carolina's children. I'm Diana Wynn, President of the League of Women Voters of Wake County. Before we begin, I have just a few announcements regarding some of our other League activities and events. We have some members only events coming up that may interest many of our League members. Our next Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Roundtable discussion is on January 26th, and it will explore the topic of reparations for African Americans as a result of slavery and systemic racism. This is a members only activity open to any League member in North Carolina. Our next League Lit event will discuss Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. Monthly League Lit sessions are open to any member of the Wake League, even if you haven't had a chance to quite finish reading the book. Our next Timely Topics webinar is February 18th, and it will feature North Carolina's Secretary of Health and Human Services, Dr. Mandy Cohen, who will give us updates on COVID-19 and the status of health in North Carolina. All of our Timely Topics webinars are open to the public, so tell your friends. You can find more information about all of our activities and events at LWV-Wake.org. Before we begin, I want to briefly explain how we're using the Zoom platform for this webinar. Except for the presenters, everyone is muted and you're not on video. We're not using the chat feature in Zoom today. Instead, please type your questions in the Q&A screen. If you hover your computer mouse near the center bottom of your Zoom screen, a menu should appear. You should then be able to click on the Q&A option. One of our moderators will be monitoring the Q&A screen throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, the speaker will be asked your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Please don't wait, though, until the end of the presentation to submit your questions. Go ahead and start submitting them. Cheryl Keaton, our Timely Topics Committee co-chair, will monitor the questions submitted and will serve as our moderator for the Q&A segment. This webinar is being recorded and in the next few days will appear on LWV-Wake's YouTube channel. I'd now like to turn the program over to our other Timely Topics Committee co-chair, Diane Payan, who will introduce the speaker.
Hello. Sorry. I'll try that again. Hello. We would like to introduce tonight Lynn Edmonds. She's the Outreach Director for Public Schools First North Carolina and Great Schools in Wake. She's worked in the public education advocacy for 11 years, first as a volunteer and then with Public Schools First North Carolina, beginning in 2013. She's a graduate of Peace College, now William Peace University in Raleigh. She has served on multiple PTA and civic boards, including her current at-large position on the Wake County Board of Library Commissioners. Welcome tonight to our January Timely Topics event, Lynn Edmonds, and we are so very happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be back with you all. It's been a number of years since I presented at one of your Timely Topics, and so I was thrilled to be asked back and very excited about tonight's program. I will take myself off camera in just a second. I wanted to show you my face and introduce you to Public Schools First NC if you're not familiar with us. We are a statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy group, and our goal is to inform North Carolinians about public education issues and legislation. And one of our cornerstone positions is that we resist privatization efforts and we advocate for a strong, unified public education system that is free and accessible to all children. And with that, I'll start the program. So my program tonight is divided into two parts. I'm going to first talk about the history of the Leandro case, and we'll talk about public education funding in North Carolina, and then we're actually going to pause for some questions before going to the second part about what's known as the West Ed report. Right now, let's dive into the history. What is Leandro? It is a lawsuit that was filed in North Carolina in 1994 by 5 low-wealth North Carolina counties, filed by those school districts, parents, and students in those counties. And those 5 counties are Robeson, Hoke, Halifax, Vance, and Cumberland counties. They argued that the state was in violation of our state constitution by not providing adequate, equitable funds for students to be able to receive a sound basic education. And this lawsuit was based on this part of our North Carolina Constitution. Not all state constitutions in the US have something like this written into their constitution, but North Carolina does. And again, that's the basis of this lawsuit. And it says specifically that the state must provide a sound basic education for all children. The state is responsible for those resources. Again, as I said before, the case was filed in 1994, and the very first thing that happened was the state tried to have the case dismissed. So that it went all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and in 1997, the North Carolina Supreme Court denied the dismissal, and they allowed the case to move forward. In 2002, a court ruled that the state was in fact in violation of our state constitution, and they ordered the legislature to remedy that violation. The state appealed that ruling, so the case went to the North Carolina Supreme Court a second time, and in 2004, the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled against the state again, upholding that lower court's decision from 2002. In 2004, the case was turned over to Judge Howard Manning, and between 2004 and 2016, Judge Manning held numerous hearings on a variety of issues, and he made some rulings, such as he had the State Board of Education take over Halifax County schools, but he never ordered the state to invest more funds into public education. But you can see here on this screen, a lot of people, and it's such a great question, why in the world has this case been going on since 1994? And this sort of helps us understand that a little bit better. So in 2017, Judge Manning retired, and the case is handed over to a new judge, Judge David Lee. When this transfer takes place, when Judge Manning retired, the state tried to have the case dismissed a third time, but Judge Lee did not allow that. It was under his purview, and he denied that. Between 2017 and 2018, the plaintiffs and the state both asked for an independent agency to provide recommendations on how to comply with Leandro. And Judge Lee appointed West Ed to do that work. West Ed is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research group out of California, and they do this type of work for districts across the United States. In June of 2019, West Ed submitted their report to Judge Lee, and in December of 2019, that report was made public. So what happened over the last year, as we've been through this pandemic, things got really exciting for those of us in the education advocacy world. Once that report was released, it really validated a lot of the concerns that many of us have had for many years. But again, the report was made public in December of 2019. In January of 2020, Judge Lee ordered the State Board of Education and the General Assembly to submit action plans based on the recommendations that were in the West Ed report, and he gave both of these bodies 60 days to do that. So that math is pretty easy to do in your mind. If you think of January, where we were in January of 2020, that 60-day deadline hit right about the time that COVID exploded and things shut down. So that deadline was extended. And in June of 2020, Governor Cooper and the State Board of Education submitted plans to Judge Lee, but nothing came from the North Carolina General Assembly. On September 1st, 2020, Judge Lee signed a consent order. He held a very brief hearing. It only lasted about 30 minutes, and he ordered the legislature to invest $426.9 million more into public education. And that was meant to be the first step in an 8-year plan to be in compliance. The very next day, on September 2nd, 2020, the General Assembly convened to appropriate CARES Act funds for COVID relief. They met for 2 days on the 2nd and the 3rd, and during that time, there was absolutely no discussion or debate about Leandro or any discussion or debate about Judge Lee's order that had just been issued 24 hours earlier, and they adjourned until the start of the long session, which is started now in 2021. And speaking of now, 2021, it's January, and where are we now? What's next? What's the latest? There was a report that was due to Judge Lee in December. We were all anxiously awaiting that, and we don't know the reason, but there was a request for an extension that all the parties agreed to. And so Judge Lee granted that extension, and now we expect to see that report in mid to late February. And that's when we'll know more about the what's next. And of course, we're all interested to see what the General Assembly does now that the long session has started. I want to go back to something that I said about Judge Manning. I mentioned that over that long period of time from 2004 to 2016, that he never directed the legislature to invest more funds in public education. But Judge Lee does exactly that. So what is that discrepancy? Judge Manning has always said when he's asked about this that he does not have the constitutional authority to do that, that he does not have the constitutional authority to direct the legislature to invest funds or how to invest funds. We have read many articles about this and watched programs about it, and all I can say is that there seems to be a disagreement among legal scholars and even among judges in this case, because again, Judge Manning never did that, but that's exactly what Judge Lee has done. And I'm not an attorney, so I can't go any further than that, but just understand that there does seem to be some debate about the powers of a judge in a case like this. This is just a snapshot of school funding in North Carolina. I think this is important as we discuss this case because it is largely about resources. Just so you have a general understanding of how school funding works in North Carolina. As you see, 66% of funding does come from the state. About 24% comes from your local county governments. That's going to be your county commissioners or your local boards and your local tax dollars. And then only about 10% comes from federal dollars. And those federal dollars are for very specific initiatives, programs, and line items. North Carolina's corporate tax rate is very important as we talk about funding. North Carolina now has the absolute lowest corporate tax rate in the United States. Our tax rate used to be 6.9%. It was 6.9% in 2013. And state lawmakers have slashed this corporate tax rate with every budget passed since 2013, bringing it down so low that we are now an outlier. For our neighbors to the north and the south of us, their corporate tax rates are at 5%. And in our view, this is not a distinction for North Carolina to be proud of, because we believe that this really inhibits our ability to invest in our public goods, including public education, and invest in public services that North Carolinians need. And it's just a staggering number. And 6.9% was never the highest in the country. And again, 2.5% is the absolute lowest. And this is our first pause. Cheryl, if you want to come on, I don't know if you're seeing any questions in the chat.
I don't see any, can you hear me? I don't see any questions at this time about the history portion of what you just spoke about, but I had a few questions submitted earlier.
Sure.
One in particular was about what power does the General Assembly Leandro Legislative Action Plan have? Can the General Assembly be forced to fund it? And are there any repercussions if they don't?
That's a great question. So we'll be anxious to see what's in this report from the General Assembly in February. With regard to can the judge force them to take action, we've got some examples from other states, and I apologize, I don't have the name of these two states in front of me. But in one state, we know that a judge threatened to shut down the schools if the legislature did not comply with the order. And the state ended up complying, or at least making some improvements, some remedies. In another state, the judge fined the legislature something like $100,000 per day until they complied. So there is precedent from other states where the judge can force the General Assembly to follow the order.
Of the 8 recommendations in the West Ed report, which of those are most important to Wake County? And is that something you'll talk about in part 2, or is that something you would like to answer now?
Yeah, so I need to put the Wake County piece, let me mull that over as we move forward, because I've done this, with a statewide lens. And so I need to think about that a little more, but we'll definitely dive into the 8 recommendations and some details within those 8. So that's a great question.
And one last one. Why hasn't the legislature or state been sued for refusal to honor the Leandro case? And whose responsibility is it to file such a suit?
I wish I knew, but I just go back to the fact that the North Carolina Supreme Court has twice upheld this, the lower court's ruling that the state was in violation. I think the lawsuit piece, I know that the NAACP joined the Leandro suit. There's a certain term, a legal term as to what they're called. I believe it's interveners. And the NAACP joined the case at some point. I don't have that in front of me of what year they joined, but that's not necessarily a separate lawsuit, but certainly, it's been allowed to move forward. And while we really have seen some setbacks, again, with those Supreme Court twice upholding the ruling, and these attorneys that are involved continuing to work, for so many years on the case, I also think it's going to take public pressure, which I'll talk about at the end, but I hope that answers it a little bit.
Yes, thank you. There are 2 questions that came in that are about the funding. And the first one is, what is the source of the money for schools at the state and county level?
So the state funding is the legislature. That's going to be the state budget that they pass. The governor always issues his or her own budget, but it's ultimately the legislature that, agrees to that or passes the governor's budget, which rarely they do. It's more of a, work in progress. It's a melding of the General Assembly's budgets or budget proposal and the governor's. Sometimes they overlap. But it really is the legislature's, it's in their power, it's under their control. And then what was the second part of that? Oh, the local funding comes from your county commissioners, the budgets that they pass every year. And so that's going to be, related to your local tax dollars. So your Wake County taxes. And as you can imagine, there's all kinds of inequities that we could get into because a county like Wake can afford to do things. Maybe they can supplement some of the state funding where a county, like Robeson would really struggle with that.
Right. And the last question, I think, is the funding designated for particular services or localities?
It depends on what funding you mean. There's some of that. So there's some budget items that come from the state budget, that are what we consider local bills and might have some funding tied to that. Obviously, funding that your local governments would pass, for example, the Wake County Commissioners, that funding would stay within Wake County. Okay. With a couple of exceptions when we get into talking about charter schools, but that's a whole different thing. So I'm going to move us forward if that's okay. If you see other questions, they might be answered in some of these 8 critical needs.
I think this very last one is the tax rate,
Sure.
which something that you just showed a slide of. So why is the tax rate important to funding of schools? Because
our corporate, and remember, this is our corporate tax rate, okay? So not your individual property tax rates, but the corporate tax rate. That is how we generate revenue for the state budget. and for public goods like public schools, like public services, that would be funded by the state. And the school funding is the largest part of the state budget. So we feel that, and there's other organizations, the Public School Forum talks about this quite a bit too. This is really cuts us off at the knees in our ability to fund public services, and that's going to include our public schools. So that's how the two are related.
Thank you very much.
Sure. So the second part of my program, I'm going to walk us through what's called the West Ed Report. Again, this is the report that was released to the public in December of 2019. It is really a well-written document. So before I move too far ahead, I want to say to the audience, if this is a topic that interests you, you want to take a deeper dive, I encourage you to look at the West Ed Report. I've sent a link to that you'll receive in some materials after our program. It's 300 pages, but it's divided into sections, and I find that it is really digestible for the average reader. So I encourage you to have a look, but let's walk through it just at a very high level. So the West Ed Report, they highlight 8 critical needs for North Carolina, and they're listed here on your screen. I'm not going to read all of these to you because we're going to walk through them one by one. And with each of these 8 critical needs, under each of the 8, they make specific recommendations. So that's how we're going to look at these one by one. This is critical need number 1 that has to do with finances and resources. And they make 3 recommendations under critical need 1. And those 3 recommendations are to prioritize higher needs students and provide flexibility for local needs. Number 2, ensure future stability and funding. And then identify a small number of foundational high impact investments, and I'll explain what they mean about that third one in just a second. It's kind of wordy. So here's some information you need to know framing that critical need number 1. North Carolina is 49th in the United States in what's called funding effort. And that is the amount of money that we spend relative to our GDP. And the Education Law Center has a report called Making the Grade, and they've ranked all of the 50 states, and North Carolina is 49th in funding effort. We are 46 in our per pupil spending, and then our education budget is $10 billion, which is a lot of money, right? And so oftentimes when you talk to certain lawmakers, they will tell you that $10 billion is the most that we have ever spent in the history of North Carolina on public education. And they will also tell you that it is the largest part of the whole entire state budget. And both of those statements are true. But when you take a deeper, more thoughtful look at specific categories, you find that we are actually spending less on items like textbooks, classroom resources, professional development for teachers, teaching assistants, and more. That could be a whole presentation in and of itself. Critical need number 2 calls for a well-qualified and well-prepared teacher in every classroom. They make 9 recommendations here, and those 9 recommendations are improving our teacher pipeline, improvements to the Teaching Fellows program, improving teacher residency programs in high-need rural and urban districts, enhancing programs like Grow Your Own and 2+2 programs. Those are sort of teacher development programs, diversifying our teacher workforce. And then this is a continuation of those 9. Number 6 is mentoring and support for new teachers, advanced teaching roles and additional pay for high-performing teachers. Number 8 is improving and providing professional development for teachers, and then increasing teacher pay and enable low wealth districts to compete in recruiting teachers. So what do we need to understand about critical need number 2? Out of those 9 recommendations, I'm going to focus on 2 of them for time's sake. So our teacher pipeline is really drying up, and we expect this to worsen as a result of COVID. In fact, there's a lot of reports out already, not necessarily specific to North Carolina, But nationally, we know that teachers are leaving the profession, especially, in the last year because of the pandemic. We also have know that there is a drop in enrollment in our UNC systems of schools of education. There's been more than a 30% drop in enrollment since 2011. So these are going to be our students that are going into our colleges to become teachers. Some of the drop in, at more than 30% is also due to a harmful legislation, such as the loss of master's degree pay for teachers, loss of retirement health benefits that started this month, and loss of longevity pay, loss of due process rights, et cetera. Our Teaching Fellows program is a fraction of the program that it used to be. The legislature abolished this nationally recognized program in 2011. They brought it back in 2017, but as you can see with these numbers here, it's a fraction of the program that it once was, and we need it to be more robust, and that's what WestEd is talking about under this critical need number 2 related to teachers. Another thing that's important to note, one of those 9 items that I read to you mentioned diversifying our teacher workforce. The Teaching Fellows program that we currently have does not have any HBCUs enrolled in it, and those are our historically Black colleges. The legislature was going to add one last year, but it didn't work out, and so there are 0 HBCUs in the Teaching Fellows program. Critical need number 3 calls for a qualified and well-prepared principal in every school. They make 4 recommendations here: update the principal preparation and licensure requirements, expand access to high-quality principal preparation programs, expand professional development for principals and assistant principals, that's what the AP there is, and then revise salary structures and improve working conditions. So let's look at that number 4 category, the number 4 recommendation that talks about salary structures. North Carolina ranked for a long time down at the bottom in principal pay, specifically in 2017, and this is the last ranking that we can find. We were 50th in principal pay, not something, not a place where we need to be. And the legislature did recognize this, and so they did make some changes to improve the pay scale for principals in 2017, but some of what they did is problematic. For example, they moved to a performance-based model versus an experience-based model. Some principals at the time faced major salary cuts, and that forced lawmakers to pass some hold harmless provisions. Bonuses were tied to test scores, which can be problematic, especially if you're not giving principals and teachers the resources that they need to help our most vulnerable children. And you see the quote at the bottom. This is what WestEd says in their report about that pay scale change. The new compensation system creates a disincentive for effective principals to work in underperforming schools, which often take more than 1 year to improve and meet or exceed targets for growth. Again, that's a direct quote from the WestEd report. Critical need number 4 is related to early childhood education. They call for 4 recommendations. They call for North Carolina to expand the pre-K teacher pipeline, to improve Smart Start, increase its quality, access, and support for at-risk children and families. They call for expanding North Carolina's pre-K program, and for aligning and improving the early grades in K-12 settings to promote early grade success. And we're going to talk about that number 4 recommendation as well. So expanding North Carolina pre-K, this is just, so North Carolina pre-K is what the program is called. And these are just some facts about our pre-K program. About 29,000 children were enrolled in 2019. There is a shortage of available pre-K slots across the state. Only about half of eligible children are served, and there's more than 50,000 children on a wait list to get into the program. The state's current North Carolina pre-K contribution, so that means what the legislature funds, is about $5,200 per child. The problem is that does not cover the entire cost of pre-K for that child. 60% of the cost is covered by the state, so that's at $5,200. But it's up to counties to cover the remaining 40%. And West Ed says that 44 out of 100 counties, so we have 100 counties in North Carolina, 44 of our counties, that's almost half, actually denied their state funding for NC pre-K because they could not come up with the remaining 40%. And that's really, really sobering when you think about these vulnerable children. I said that I would talk about that one recommendation where it said to improve conditions in K-12 settings. That's referring to our teacher assistants. And so West Ed, as do we at Public Schools First NC, they call for North Carolina to restore the 8,000 teaching assistant positions that we have lost since the Great Recession. That's why they were originally cut in the budget. And we've been lobbying for them to restore those positions since we started our organization. Critical need number 5 is support for high poverty schools. They make 5 recommendations here. Attract, prepare, and retain highly qualified teachers and teacher mentors. Provide additional time, resources, and access to programs that support the whole child. Revise school accountability to better reflect gains. Provide more helping professionals. And provide resources and supports to address out-of-school barriers. So recommendation number 3, it talks about revising school accountability. This is referring to our state A through F school letter grades. These letter grades have been in place since about 2015, I believe. What they are is they are a letter grade that is actually assigned to a school. So this is not talking about student A through F grades. These are letter grades that are assigned to a school. Only about 16 states in the country do this. And our formula for grading schools is the worst of all the states that even have this program. At Public Schools First NC, we view this as a privatization tool. Our grades are directly correlated with poverty. So in other words, schools that have higher income students and very few students that live in poverty get the A and the B scores. And our schools that have high numbers of students from low income homes or low income situations, they usually get the D's and the F's. And these grades never tell you the full picture of what is really happening in a school. Our grades are calculated by 80% test score and 20% growth. And when you don't weigh growth at a higher level, it really skews the way that a school is perceived. So it makes it easy for a school to be, quote, labeled, quote, failing. And it can be very hard, even if a school shows growth, because that growth is only counted at 20%, it can be hard to get out of a stigmatizing D or F. And this is the quote that was in the West Ed report about the accountability A through F system. It emphasizes students' proficiency status over growth, which results in a strong bias against schools that largely serve economically disadvantaged students, and fails to credit those schools with successful efforts that are foundational to their students receiving a sound basic education. One of the other recommendations that is made under Critical Need 4 is about helping professionals. This is a snapshot of how we fund helping professionals in North Carolina and where we are. What you see on the left side of your screen is what is the national recommended numbers. In the center, you see what is funded by the state budget. And then on the right, where it says North Carolina averages, those are the actual numbers that we see across the state in our schools. So for example, if we look at what's recommended for counselors, the national recommendation is 1 counselor for every 250 students. North Carolina only funds 1 counselor for every 413 students. But you see the average is a little bit better. So it's a little bit closer to that national recommendation. The way we get these averages over on the right side of your screen is through your local dollars. So for example, In Wake County, we are able to supplement funding that the state does not provide. So Wake County is able, and counties like Charlotte, Mecklenburg, some other, districts, they're able to supplement. And so they might be able to provide more counselors than the state pays for. And the same goes with the social workers. You can see those numbers if you just, go from left to right, you see how that changes. So it really does matter who your local elected officials are and what level of support they have for public education. Critical need number 6. This has to do with student testing. So we're actually not going to take a deep dive into this one because it's rather complicated, and we don't feel it's really what the best use of our time to take a deep dive here. But I've given you those page numbers. So if student assessment and student testing is important to you, that you can find that detail on pages 107 to 123 of the report. And again, I've sent you the link to the report that you'll receive later. Critical need number 7, regional and statewide supports for school improvement. They make 4 recommendations here. They say to rebuild North Carolina DPI's, that's the Department of Public Instruction is DPI, to rebuild their district and school transformation division, to provide resources and supports for low performing and high poverty schools, to address out of school barriers, provide supports that facilitate culturally responsive curriculum, and then extend supports that further some of the programs that run through the Department of Public Instruction. That's the number 4 with all those letters. I want to talk about number 1, rebuilding DPI's DTST model, and that is District and School Transformation Model. This is a program that DPI had that was specifically about turning around low-performing schools. And they were having successes with these turnaround efforts. They were having success with this model. It included leadership development for principals, community engagement, and supports for the whole child. It included intensive professional development for teachers. And DPI, they sent their professionals, their mentors, and their coaches to these districts. The teachers that worked in these districts did not have to come to Raleigh. The state, through DPI, they sent the mentors and coaches to them and helped them in their own communities. This model was very robust for a short 3-year period, largely because of federal race to the top dollars. But in 2015, the General Assembly made drastic cuts to DPI. There were other cuts in other years, but this particular cut were targeted at the Educator Support Services Division, and that is who facilitated this DST model. And again, they did have successes. WestEd goes into detail about the successes that they had with this program. Another note about this is this was one of the things that Judge Manning, one of his orders, really helped this program and helped it be successful. And we are no longer in compliance with that order from Judge Manning. Critical need number 8, monitoring state compliance. This is basically, about making sure the state complies and following progress. It says that the court should appoint a panel of education experts to monitor the state's plans, initiatives, and progress, and that the court should require annual reports of plans and progress. What you should know about all of these 8 critical needs and recommendations, and I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, this WestEd has provided an action plan. They don't leave it up to us to try to figure out. They've laid out an action plan that is divided into 3 phases. So these are not just them telling us what we should do, but they actually sort of coach us on how to get it done. That's on pages 140 to 153 of the report. And then this is the price tag. What will it cost? That's a legitimate question. In the report, it was widely reported, the way that we read it and the way that a lot of media outlets read it, is that WestEd was saying it was going to cost $8 billion in additional funding over the next 8 years. The reason, the 8 years piece, I just want to point out to you, is when we have state budgets, they are passed, they're biennial budgets. So they're 2-year budgets that are passed. And so that's where you get, so over the next 4 budget cycles, if you will, $8 billion. My friend over at the North Carolina Justice Center, Chris Nordstrom, some of you may be familiar with some of his work. He's written an article, and this is another one of the links that I've sent to you that you'll receive after our program. He says that that number is inflated by as much as 60%, and that actually if North Carolina would just come up to the national average, and national averages of things like per pupil spending, teacher pay, principal pay, et cetera, that it actually would not take $8 billion to fund. I'll let you read that article instead of getting into the details. But one argument, I want to remind us of this. This is the 3rd time we've seen this slide. In our view at Public Schools First NC, we believe that we need to raise this corporate tax rate, or honestly restore it. And the reason I use the term restore is because North Carolina's corporate tax rate was 6.9% in 2013. So it's not that we would be, making up a number, but just raising it, even if we went up to 5%, like our neighbors to the north and the south of us, Virginia and South Carolina, we don't need to be this outlier of having this lowest rate in the United States, because again, it really hurts our ability to invest in our public schools.
Lynn, we have a lot of questions here for you.
Good. I feel funny not, talking to a questions box.
Well, we can see you now. That's nice too. Thank you. These will kind of jump around between the historical, because there's some questions about the judges' rulings.
Yep.
Does Judge Lee's decision include the funds from the lottery that have been sent from education to other state costs?
No, the lottery funding is already dictated how that money is spent. And I used to know how much Wake County got every year. It might be like 5% of lottery funds or something like that. We do have a fact sheet about the lottery on our website under our fact sheets tab. That's a great question. It always comes up. The general consensus about the lottery money is every time the lottery is introduced in a state, and this is true for North Carolina too, rarely does it become in addition to money that's in addition to, state budget funding. Oftentimes, the lottery money will replace investments that the state used to make. So it's not the lottery is icing on the cake. Rather, they cut back on state spending and instead use lottery money to fund those things. And that's one of the criticisms about the lottery. But no, Judge Lee's order, to my knowledge, does not include lottery funds.
What is the cost impact of cutting retirement?
I don't know the dollar amount, but let me explain that. I'm glad somebody asked that question. So when I was talking about the retirement health benefits that have gone away, this was in one of the last budgets, like from 2017-19. It said that for any new teacher in North Carolina, so whether that's a homegrown teacher or someone coming here from out of state, new North Carolina teachers hired in January 2021 and moving forward will not receive health benefits upon retirement. And that used to be such a carrot, if you will, of teaching and working in the public sector, is that you had these benefits that you knew you could count on at your retirement. And they've taken that away, and that we feel that's really, really going to damage our pipeline even further.
The next question is, in recommendation number 1, in what area are we spending the most money?
So within the state budget, what's the biggest piece? Okay, I mean, that's how I hear that question. So within the state budget, with education funding specifically, the biggest piece is going to be your personnel. So your teachers, your principals, those two buckets are going to be the biggest part of where that money is going, is your teacher salaries, benefits, and principals and administration. But when I say administration, I'm talking about school-based administration. I'm not talking about central offices. There's a myth that central offices are bloated, and actually, they're usually well under 10% of a particular school system's budget. In other words, so Wake County, for example, I think other districts get accused of this too. People will criticize the central office staff, the bureaucrats or what have you, that too much money goes to the central office. And I know in Wake County, it is well under 10%. The central office of Wake County Public Schools is not the bulk of the funding for Wake County Public Schools. I hope that makes sense.
Right. Since better educated citizens make better employees, is there support from the business community to increase funding for education, even if it means higher corporate tax rates?
I think that's what I hear every time I hear any business leaders speaking from the public school forum. They have a number of business leaders on their board, and they do support raising that corporate tax rate, and they do support increasing funds for public education. Oftentimes you'll hear business leaders say that when they are recruiting employees, it's to their benefit if they don't have to pay salaries like some other states. When they're recruiting employees, if they don't have to add into the salaries money for private school because we have a strong public school system, that's to their bottom line benefit. And so often, they help us advocate for better funding because it's a better recruitment tool for them and for their employees.
So to follow up on that, then another person has asked, are there any bills in the North Carolina General Assembly to raise corporate tax rate?
Not that I've heard. Now, there could be some that have been introduced and died, but I'm not aware of any. That doesn't mean they haven't been filed, but I've not seen anything about that in the media, and I've not seen anything about that. What we track with the General Assembly are education committees and education legislation and bills. Even if they don't pass, we still follow those. And I've not seen anything, come through to increase that corporate tax rate.
Right. This goes back to retirement benefits. The same retirement benefits reduction will be true for all local government employees as well.
Not just local, all state employees. Yes, and
right.
Thank you. Whoever made that clarification, you're absolutely right. It is not just for teachers. All state employees hired in January of 2021 and beyond will not receive retirement health benefits. And we see that as just a huge problem.
Right. And this person followed up with not really a question, but a statement. Also with regard to the local match for North Carolina pre-K funds, many local match dollars are taken from the Smart Start allocation to match the pre-K funding, a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation. And you don't know if you want to comment on that or.
I mean, I agree. And I'll go further. We at Public Schools First NC, we advocate for universal pre-K. And what that would mean is that we believe that North Carolina should fund preschool for every child in the state that needs it, that can't afford it. And the benefits, the research and the data on the benefits of investing in pre-K is abundant. It helps students be successful up, through third grade and even beyond third grade. When a student receives a strong quality preschool education program, they are more likely to graduate high school. And again, as far as their achievement is concerned, they do better they're able to be on grade level in third grade, or more likely to be, and the strengths and the academic successes continue into the upper elementary school and middle school. I mean, the research is very, very clear. And West Ed does cite some of that research in their report in that section about early childhood education.
Another question is, were any of the CARES Act funds used to improve public education?
Not necessarily improve. They really were very targeted to the problems that we saw with the pandemic, right? So devices for students. I don't know that, I can't really say that there was any staffing increases from the COVID relief, but definitely with device help, with feeding children that weren't getting their school meals, things like that were what was in the CARES Act money.
Could we return to the question about Wake County specifically? Of the 8 recommendations in the West Ed report, which is or are most important to Wake County? And then I think you're going to talk a little bit about also advocacy. So in a second part to that could be, what is the most important advocacy effort we can make for Wake County schools?
I struggle to point to one of those 8 critical needs that would be more important to Wake County than any of the other. I mean, you know, the truth of the matter is that Wake County, you know, let's go back to think about the 5 counties that originally filed this lawsuit. Again, those were low wealth rural counties. You know, Wake County was not part of the Leandro case in 1994. We are not, you know, one of the plaintiffs now. And that's because we can afford to supplement some of these things that the state may not provide or are short on, if you will. But more and more has been pushed down to the county level. And we would argue that it is not, whether or not Wake or Charlotte-Mecklenburg, whether or not we can afford it, it's not your local property taxes and your local tax dollars that should be funding these things. It is the state's responsibility. And again, that goes back to what's in our state constitution. So while, for example, we have a local organization called Great Schools in Wake, and we definitely go to the commissioners every year and ask for supplemental funding, like for more counselors, more school nurses, et cetera. But that really should come from the state. We should be hitting those, you know, national recommendations from state dollars. So I hesitate to say that one of the 8 critical needs or more are specific to Wake County, because we really need to be pushing for Leandro, compliance with Leandro and this funding for every kid in North Carolina, for all school districts in North Carolina. And speaking of that advocacy piece, let me we've got like 3 more slides. Oh, and it doesn't want to advance again. All right, one moment. I can say it without showing it to you, but it would be nice to show these to you. Well, my escape button isn't even working. All right, well, we'll just talk through it. So let me get back on camera. So I wanted you to know that we are part of an advocacy group, a statewide coalition called Every Child NC. And that is us, it's the Public School Forum, it's the North Carolina Justice Center, it's the ACLU of North Carolina, Education Justice Alliance. It's a bunch of statewide organizations that are all working together to move Leandro forward and to advocate for the legislature to comply with Leandro and to provide this funding. Again, it's everychildnc.org. That's how you find us. And we're a member of that statewide coalition. And I'm sorry you can't see that screen. What can you do? I mean, definitely call your state lawmakers. We have a whole webinar on how to find if you don't know who your legislators are, how to find your House member and your Senate member. So contact them, talk to them. But I think this is also going to come down to public pressure. You know, we don't know if Judge Lee will take lead from those other states and fine the General Assembly $100,000 a day if they don't comply. We don't know if he'll threaten to shut down the schools if the legislature doesn't comply. So I think it's really going to come down to public pressure. And that's not just talking to state lawmakers, but it's also educating more North Carolinians about this court case and about these needs. So tell your friends, tell your league members, continue to talk about it. talk to the press about it, write a letter to the editor or an op-ed, because the press will follow what the public is talking about, what the public is concerned about. So if the local newspaper, if they receive 30 letters about the Leandro case, they're going to do a story on it. So, we just got to continue to talk about it and educate our friends and neighbors in our networks. And I'm watching the time. I know you all are too. So I might see if I can get these screens showing while, I don't know if you all have any other questions or comments.
I'm looking here at the last questions that are coming in, and I think we have, most of them are comments about things that you've answered. You'll be able to see some of those in a little bit. But I wanted to thank you, Lynn Edmonds, so much for being here. You have really made a complex issue much easier to understand and have given us a lot of food for thought about ways that we can bring about change.
There we
wish
go.
you luck.
I at least want this to be on the recording so people can easily grab the website.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
And then here is my contact information. So for anything that didn't get answered tonight, or follow us on all of our social media, email me. Our collective email is there too, where you see info@publicschoolsfirstnc.org. And I just want to say again that I'm so excited to be with you, and I really appreciate the invitation. And I know I threw a lot of information at you, so please reach out. I know it's a lot to digest.
Well, we look forward to having you back again. This was very informative, and I know you had so much more you could have shown us, so please come again. Thank you, everyone. The webinar was recorded, and we will be posting it on the LWV-Wake YouTube channel within a few days. And please don't miss our next Timely Topics presentation on February the 18th, when Dr. Mandy Cohen will give a presentation and updates on COVID-19 and the status of health in North Carolina.